The moment Alexander Chen's world shattered began like any other Tuesday evening at Pacific Mall. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished marble floors as he strode past the luxury boutiques, mind consumed with the quarterly earnings report he'd review tomorrow. At 32, he'd built Chen Tech into a $4.2 billion empire, but lately, even success tasted stale. A child's laughter pierced his thoughts, bright, melodic, and strangely familiar. Alexander's steps faltered as his gaze was drawn to the central fountain, where two children played tag around the cascading water. They were perhaps 4 or 5 years old, a boy and girl with matching jet black hair and almond-shaped amber eyes that mirrored his own with unsettling precision. His heart stuttered. Time seemed to slow as he watched the little girl dodge her brother's attempt to catch her, her pigtails bouncing with each step. The boy's determined expression was one Alexander recognized from his own childhood photos. But it was their eyes, that distinctive Chen family trait, a shade of amber so unusual it had graced every generation of his family tree, that made his blood run cold. Jason. Emma. Time to go, sweethearts, and that voice. 5 years had passed, but he'd know it anywhere. Sarah Mitchell emerged from Cartier, copper hair catching the evening light, just as it had that night at the charity gala. She looked different now, more confident, successful, but still achingly beautiful in her tailored business suit. Alexander's mind raced through the calculations. 5 years since their one night together. The twins' apparent age. Their eyes. His legs went weak, forcing him to grip a nearby pillar for support as the truth crashed over him like a tidal wave. These were his children, his twins, a son and daughter he never knew existed. Memories of that night flooded back the charity gala, their intense connection, the way Sarah challenged his views on corporate responsibility while sending electricity through his veins with every glance. He remembered leaving before dawn, convinced it was the responsible choice with Chen Tech's expansion on the horizon. His assistant Karen had mentioned Sarah's calls in the weeks that followed, but Alexander had been too consumed with work to respond, trusting Karen to handle it like she handled everything else. Now, watching Sarah gather the twins' belongings while they begged for 5 more minutes, Alexander realized the magnitude of what he'd missed. First steps, first words, first everything. His chest constricted with an unfamiliar ache as he watched his son Jason help his sister collect her dropped toys, displaying a protective instinct that must have come from Sarah's influence. He had to grip the pillar tighter as another realization hit him: Sarah had done this alone. While he'd been building his empire, she'd been raising their children, and from the looks of their designer clothes and Sarah's obvious success, she'd done it without a penny of his money or a moment of his time. The weight of 5 years of absence crashed down on Alexander's shoulders as he watched his newfound family prepare to leave. He had a choice to make: stay hidden behind this pillar and let them walk away, or step forward and face the consequences of that long-ago morning when he'd chosen his company over connection. The twins' laughter echoed off the mall's high ceilings, a sound that would haunt him forever if he let them disappear now. 5 years earlier, the Tech for Tomorrow charity gala. The ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel sparkled with San Francisco's tech royalty, champagne flutes catching the light from crystal chandeliers. Sarah Mitchell stood near the edge of the crowd, watching Silicon Valley's elite congratulate themselves on their philanthropy while drinking $1,000 bottles of wine. Her emerald dress, the one splurge she'd allowed herself after securing her first major contract, felt suddenly inadequate among the designer gowns. These events are always a bit much, aren't they? The voice came from behind her, rich and warm with a hint of amusement. Sarah turned to find Alexander Chen standing there, looking devastatingly handsome in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. She'd researched him extensively before pitching her water purification system to Chen Tech's investment board. But his photos hadn't captured the intensity of his amber eyes or the subtle quirk of his lips when he smiled. "I suppose when you're worth billions, this counts as modest," Sarah replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "Though I noticed your speech didn't mention how many of these tech companies actually contribute to the environmental problems they're supposedly solving." Instead of being offended, Alexander's eyes lit up with interest. "Most people just want to talk about Chen Tech's stock prices or my latest acquisition." "I'm not most people, Mr. Chen." "Please," he said, loosening his bow tie slightly, "call me Alexander." They found their way to a quiet corner of the balcony, the San Francisco skyline glittering behind them. What started as a discussion about corporate responsibility evolved into sharing their dreams, their fears, their hopes for changing the world. Sarah told him about growing up in a small town where the local river ran brown with factory waste, sparking her passion for environmental engineering. Alexander spoke about losing his parents young, channeling his grief into building something meaningful. "You're different," he said softly, hours later. "You see past all of this," he gestured at the opulent ballroom behind them. "Maybe I just see you," Sarah replied. The kiss, when it came, felt inevitable. His lips were soft but demanding, his hands cupping her face with surprising tenderness. The world narrowed to just this moment, just them. "Come home with me," Sarah whispered against his mouth. Her apartment in Hayes Valley was modest but warm, filled with plants and books and character. Alexander took in every detail, as if cataloguing pieces of her soul. When he kissed her again in the doorway, it was slower, deeper, full of promise. That night was perfect. They moved together like they'd known each other for years instead of hours. Alexander traced constellations on her skin, whispered Mandarin endearments in her ear. Sarah had never felt so seen, so understood. In those hours, she let herself believe this could be the beginning of something extraordinary. Dawn painted her bedroom in soft grays when Sarah woke alone. A handwritten note lay on the pillow beside her. "Last night was incredible. Here's my private number." She didn't call immediately, wanting to give them both time to process. But 3 days later, when she couldn't stop thinking about him, she dialed the number. Mr. Chen's office, a crisp female voice answered. "Hi, this is Sarah Mitchell. I'm trying to reach Alexander." "I'm sorry, Mr. Chen is unavailable. May I ask what this is regarding?" This became a pattern. Every call met with his assistant Karen's polite but firm deflection. Her emails went unanswered. When she tried visiting Chentex's offices, security turned her away. Then came the morning sickness. The positive pregnancy test. Tests, plural, she took 4, just to be sure. The ultrasound that revealed not 1 heartbeat but 2. Sarah sat in her doctor's office, staring at the grainy ultrasound image showing 2 tiny forms. Twins. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, trying Alexander's number one last time. Mr. Chen's office. "Please," Sarah's voice cracked. "It's Sarah Mitchell. I really need to speak with him. It's important." "I'm sorry, Ms. Mitchell, but Mr. Chen has made it clear he doesn't wish to be disturbed by personal matters. I'll have to ask you to stop calling." The line went dead. Sarah pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling a fierce protectiveness surge through her. Fine. If Alexander Chen was too busy building his empire to take her calls, she would do this on her own. She had a business to build too, after all. Her children, their children, would never want for anything. That evening, she sat at her tiny kitchen table with her laptop, drawing up a business plan for her environmental consulting firm. Between her savings and the contract she'd just landed, she could make this work. Her babies kicked inside her, as if offering encouragement. "It's just us," she whispered, rubbing her growing belly. "But we're going to be amazing." She threw herself into work, determined to build something meaningful before the twins arrived. Each milestone of her pregnancy was celebrated with her sister Kate and her growing circle of supportive friends. If she sometimes woke in the night remembering amber eyes and gentle hands, well, that was her secret to keep. When Jason and Emma arrived on a rainy spring morning, their tiny faces perfect and their eyes that unmistakable Chen amber, Sarah felt no regret. Looking at their beautiful faces, she knew she'd made the right choice. These babies were her miracle, her purpose, her future. Alexander Chen had chosen his path, she had chosen hers. The view from the 48th floor of Chentec Tower spanned the entire San Francisco Bay, but Alexander Chen barely noticed it anymore. Tonight, like most nights, he sat alone in his office past 9, surrounded by the trappings of success that felt increasingly hollow. The latest industry magazine on his desk featured his face on the cover text "Most Eligible Bachelor, The Lonely Life" at the top. He'd scoffed at the title when it was published last week. Now, after seeing Sarah and the twins at the mall, those words haunted him. The children's laughter echoed in his mind, a sound so pure it made his chest ache. His children. The thought still knocked the breath from his lungs every time it crossed his mind. Mr. Chen Karen appeared in his doorway, tablet in hand. "The board is concerned about your cancellation of tomorrow's merger meeting." Alexander looked at his assistant of 7 years, the woman who'd protected him from Sarah's calls, who'd deemed them unimportant interruptions. He'd always trusted Karen's judgment in screening his contacts, appreciated her fierce guardianship of his time. Now that trust felt like poison. "Tell them something more important came up," he said, his voice hard. "And Karen? Pull everything you can find on Sarah Mitchell and Green Future Solutions. Everything." Hours later, Alexander sat in his home office, surrounding himself with printouts and digital records of Sarah's life over the past 5 years. The story they told made his guilt spiral deeper with each detail. She'd launched Green Future Solutions just months after that night, while pregnant with their twins. The company had started small, focusing on sustainable water systems for developing nations. Now it was one of the most respected environmental consulting firms in the country. Sarah had done interviews for Forbes, won innovation awards, spoken at the UN about climate change solutions. And she'd done it all while raising their children alone. Alexander found himself looking at every photo he could find, hunting for glimpses of the twins in the background of business event pictures or charity galas. The Jason and Emma, at age 2, barely visible behind Sarah as she accepted an entrepreneurship award. Another at age 4, holding their mother's hands at a climate change rally. His son had his nose, his grandfather's strong jawline already visible in his young face. His daughter had Sarah's smile, but his determination written in every line of her stance. They were perfect. They were strangers. They were his blood, and he'd missed every moment of their lives. The night blurred as Alexander dug deeper. School records showed the twins attended Presidio Hill School, one of the city's best private institutions. Jason was already reading at a 3rd grade level. Emma had won a children's science fair with a project on water conservation. They took piano lessons on Tuesdays, had soccer practice on Thursdays. A whole life he'd known nothing about. He found himself walking the quiet streets of Pacific Heights at midnight, stopping outside the beautiful Victorian home listed as Sarah's address. Warm light glowed from a 2nd-floor window. A child's bicycle painted sparkly purple leaned against the porch. Through the front window he could see colorful artwork taped to the walls, a stack of board games on a coffee table, a life built without him. "Why didn't you try harder to reach me?" he whispered to the night air. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was the wrong question. The real question was, why hadn't he tried at all? Back in his penthouse apartment, Alexander stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, city lights twinkling below like fallen stars. The space had always felt perfectly adequate, minimalist, efficient, designed for a life lived mostly at the office. Now it felt sterile, empty. There were no children's drawings on these walls, no scattered toys or evidence of family meals shared around a table. He thought of all the deals he'd closed in the past 5 years, the acquisitions and mergers that had seemed so vital at the time. What were they worth compared to first steps missed? First words unheard. Birthday parties uncelebrated. His phone buzzed, another crisis at the office requiring his immediate attention. For the first time in his career, Alexander Chen ignored it. Instead, he pulled up his browser and typed "how to be a good father when you've missed everything." The search results blurred as tears filled his eyes. He had built an empire of silicon and circuitry, but he'd missed building something far more precious. The question now was whether it was too late to start. Opening his laptop, Alexander began to plan. Not with the clinical efficiency he brought to business deals, but with trembling hands and a heart full of hope and fear in equal measure. He would find a way to make this right. He had to. He owed it to the little boy who shared his eyes, the little girl who had his determination. He owed it to Sarah, who'd built something amazing while he'd been building walls. Most of all, he owed it to himself, to the man he should have been 5 years ago, and the father he desperately wanted to become. "Mummy, Jason took my dinosaur again." Sarah Mitchell looked up from her laptop, where she'd been reviewing proposals for a new sustainable water project in Ethiopia. Emma stood in the doorway of her home office, arms crossed, looking so much like her father when he was determined that it made Sarah's heart catch. Did not Jason's voice carried from down the hall? "I'm just borrowing it for my museum." 5-minute warning for breakfast, Sarah called out, closing her laptop. The children's footsteps thundered down the hallway as they raced to the kitchen, their argument temporarily forgotten in the promise of food. This was her Life Now conference calls scheduled around school pickups, international project proposals drafted during soccer practice, and board meetings that had to end in time for dance recitals. Somehow, she'd made it work. Green Future Solutions had grown beyond her wildest dreams, expanding from her kitchen table to offices in 3 countries. The company's innovative water purification systems were transforming communities across the globe. Last month's Forbes profile had called her the water queen of Silicon Valley, but Sarah took more pride in the letters from villages where her systems had brought clean water for the first time. "Mom, can you make the pancakes look like stars today?" Emma asked, climbing onto her usual stool at the kitchen island. At 5, she was already showing signs of being a brilliant engineer, constantly taking apart her toys to see how they worked. "Only if you promise to eat the blueberries," Sarah bargained, already reaching for the pancake mold. Jason, ever the negotiator, piped up from his seat. "If we eat all our breakfast, can we have extra story time tonight?" Sarah smiled, remembering how Alexander had shown the same skill at striking deals. The twins had inherited so much from him: Jason's analytical mind, Emma's determination, their shared love of solving puzzles. Sometimes it felt like the universe was playing a cruel joke, giving her daily reminders of the man who'd walked away. But she'd never regretted her decision to raise them alone. The past 5 years had been a whirlwind of midnight feedings, board meetings, burst steps, funding rounds, and countless moments of joy and exhaustion. Her sister Kate had been invaluable, stepping in to help whenever Sarah's work demanded travel. The twins' nanny, Maria, had become like family. Mess. Mitchell, her assistant's voice came through the kitchen speaker. "The Singapore team is ready for the video call." 10 minutes, Sarah responded, flipping the last pancake. "All right, munchkins, Operation Breakfast needs to go into hyperdrive." The twins giggled, falling into their familiar routine. They'd grown up understanding that their mother changed the world while making their lunches, and they'd adapted with remarkable resilience. Later that afternoon, between a sustainability conference call and the twins' parent-teacher conference, Sarah found herself staring at an old photo on her phone. It was from the night of the gala. Someone had captured her and Alexander laughing on the balcony. They'd looked so young, so full of possibility. Mum Jason's voice pulled her back to the present. "Are you okay?" Sarah quickly locked her phone, turning to her son with a smile. "Just thinking, sweetheart. How was school?" "We learned about DNA today," he said excitedly. "About how we get different things from our mum and dad. Emma has your hair, but we both have dad's eyes." The simple observation made Sarah's chest tight. The twins had started asking more questions about their father lately. She'd always been honest, telling them that their father was a businessman who wasn't able to be part of their lives. She never spoke badly of Alexander, never wanted them to feel unwanted. But lately she'd caught herself wondering what would happen if he ever discovered the truth. The twins were getting older, more visible in the tech community's social circles. Someone was bound to notice the resemblance eventually. Miss Mitchell Clare appeared in her office doorway. "The contractors for the new lab space need your signature." Sarah nodded, pushing aside her worries. She had built this life carefully, brick by brick. Green Future Solutions was revolutionizing water access in developing nations. The twins were thriving. She had everything she needed. But that night, watching Emma and Jason build an elaborate fort in the living room, Sarah allowed herself to acknowledge the fear that had been growing since she'd spotted a familiar figure at the mall yesterday. She wasn't certain, but she could have sworn she'd seen Alexander Chen watching them, his face pale with shock. The possibility of his reappearance threatened the careful balance she'd constructed. Part of her wanted to grab the twins and run, protect them from the potential pain of rejection. Another part remembered the way Alexander had looked at her that night, like she was the answer to a question he'd never thought to ask. "Mom," Emma called. "Come see our fort. We made it earthquake-proof." Sarah pushed herself up from the couch, leaving her worries behind. Whatever tomorrow brought, tonight she had 2 brilliant children who needed her to test their architectural innovation. The rest would sort itself out. But as she crawled into their blanket fortress, Sarah couldn't quite shake the feeling that her carefully constructed world was about to change forever. The security guard at Green Future Solutions looked uncertain as Alexander Chen strode through the lobby. "Sir, you need an appointment." It's all right, Michael. Sarah's voice cut through the tension. She stood by the elevators, somehow looking both powerful and vulnerable in her charcoal business suit. I've been expecting him. The ride to her office was silent, charged with 5 years of unspoken words. Sarah's heels clicked against the recycled bamboo flooring as she led him into a corner office with a view rival to his own. Framed photographs of the twins lined one wall: birthday parties, science fairs, Halloween costumes. A lifetime of memories he'd missed. I assume you're here about Jason and Emma, Sarah said, closing the door. Why didn't you tell me? The words burst from him, raw and painful. Sarah's laugh was sharp enough to cut. Tell you? I tried, Alexander. For weeks I tried. Your assistant blocked my calls. Your company's security wouldn't let me past the lobby. What was I supposed to do? Take out a billboard? You could have tried harder. Even as he said it, Alexander knew how ridiculous it sounded. Tried harder. Sarah's voice rose. I was 26, suddenly pregnant with twins, and building a company from scratch. Every time I reached out, you shut me down. So I made a choice. I chose to put my energy into our children instead of chasing a man who clearly didn't want to be found. Alexander sank into a chair, the fight draining from him. They're incredible, Sarah. I saw them at the mall. They're so perfect. They are. Sarah's voice softened slightly. And they've had a wonderful life without. A commotion outside interrupted her. The office door burst open as Emma and Jason ran in, followed by a flustered-looking assistant. Mom, we finished our science project early and Maria brought us to show you. Emma stopped short, her amber eyes widening as she saw Alexander. Jason stepped slightly in front of his sister, protective even at 5. Who are you? The silence that followed felt endless. Sarah moved to her children, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. Jason, Emma, this is Mr. Chen. I'm your father, Alexander said softly, his voice cracking. The twins' reactions were as different as their personalities. Emma took a step back, pressing against her mother's leg. Jason's face crunched in confusion, then anger. No, you're not, he said firmly. Our dad isn't here. He's busy with his company. Each word felt like a knife in Alexander's chest. Sarah squeezed Jason's shoulder. Sweetie, remember how I told you your father was a businessman who couldn't be with us? This is him. He just found out about you. Found out? Emma's voice was small but sharp. Didn't you tell him about us? I tried, baby Sarah said. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. Big mistakes. The biggest mistake of my life, Alexander added, dropping to one knee to be at their eye level. I didn't know about you, but I want to know you now. If you'll let me. Emma studied him with an engineer's precision. We have your eyes, she said finally. You do. Alexander smiled through tears he hadn't realized were falling. And Jason has my mother's nose. And you both are so smart, just like your mum. Do you like dinosaurs? Jason asked suddenly, his defenses lowering slightly. I love dinosaurs. My favorite is the Parasaurolophus. That's Emma's favorite too. Jason's excitement broke through before he remembered he was supposed to be suspicious. He frowned again. But where were you? Mum had to come to all our school things alone. The raw honesty of a child's question stripped away all pretense. Alexander looked at his son, seeing hurt and hope warring in eyes, so like his own. I was foolish, he said quietly. I thought my company was the most important thing in the world, but I was wrong. You, your sister, your mum, you're what's important. I know I can't make up for missing so much, but I'd like to try if you'll give me a chance. Emma stepped forward, her small hand reaching out to touch his cheek where tears had fallen. Mum says everyone deserves a second chance if they're truly sorry. Sarah made a choked sound behind them. When Alexander looked up, he saw her own eyes were wet. We have a science fair project to show, Jason announced, some of his natural enthusiasm returning. Want to see? I did the hypothesis and Emma did the experiment design. I'd love to, Alexander said, his heart so full it hurt. 10 minutes, Sarah said firmly. Then Maria needs to take you home for dinner. As the twins excitedly set up their project on Sarah's conference table, Alexander turned to her. Sarah, I know I have no right to ask. You don't, she cut him off. But they do. They have every right to know their father. if he's willing to be the father they deserve. I want to be. I'll do whatever it takes. Sarah watched the twins explaining their project to Alexander, saw the way they unconsciously mirrored his gestures. We'll take it slow, she said finally. Very slow. And at the first sign you're going to hurt them. I won't, Alexander promised. I can't lose them again. Any of you. The look Sarah gave him was complex hope and fear, anger and remembrance, and something else he didn't dare name. Prove it, she said simply. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But as Alexander turned back to his children's excited explanations of their hypothesis on plant growth in recycled water, he knew it was a beginning. And this time he wouldn't waste it. Over the next 6 months, Alexander Chen shocked Silicon Valley by becoming a different kind of CEO. Board meetings were scheduled around school plays. Merger discussions waited until after soccer games. His corner office at Chen Tech now featured crayon drawings alongside market projections. The first time he missed an important investor call because Emma had a fever, his assistant Karen nearly fainted. But Alexander simply rescheduled, spending the afternoon reading stories to his daughter while she dozed against his chest. Some things, he was learning, were worth more than billion-dollar deals. Daddy, watch this, Jason called from the swimming pool, where Alexander had been teaching him to dive. The word daddy still felt like a gift every time he heard it. He cheered as his son executed a somewhat wobbly cannonball, pretending not to notice Sarah watching them from the patio. She was trying, they both were. The ice between them had begun to thaw, helped along by the twins' innocent enthusiasm. But trust, once broken, took time to rebuild. The children's school called today, Sarah mentioned one evening, as they watched the twins build a robot together. They need to update their emergency contact list. They asked if they should add you. The question beneath the question hung in the air. Alexander looked at her steadily. Only if you're comfortable with it. I know I have to earn that trust. Sarah studied him for a long moment. You haven't missed a single appointment or event in 6 months. The twins, they light up when they see you. Just don't make me regret this. It wasn't just the big moments that mattered. Alexander learned to braid Emma's hair for gymnastics, memorized Jason's complex lunch preferences, and somehow found himself organizing the school's science fair fundraiser. He discovered that success could be measured in small victories, Emma finally mastering a difficult piano piece, Jason overcoming his fear of public speaking, both twins beaming with pride when he attended their parent-teacher conference. The changes rippled through his company as well. Chen Tech introduced industry-leading parental leave policies. The company's charitable foundation expanded its focus to include educational initiatives. Alexander's new corner office had a play area stocked with toys and books. Sarah noticed the changes too. She saw how Alexander would drop everything to answer the twins' video calls, how he researched parenting books late into the night, how he tried to make up for lost time without overwhelming them. You're different, she said one afternoon, after watching him spend hours helping the twins build an elaborate treehouse. I'm trying to be, he replied, wiping sawdust from his once immaculate suit. They make me want to be better. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. During a weekend at the beach, Emma got caught in a strong current while swimming. Before Sarah could even move, Alexander was in the water, reaching their daughter in seconds and bringing her safely to shore. That night, after the twins were asleep in their beach house beds, Sarah found Alexander on the deck, still shaken. You know what scared me most, he said quietly. Not the danger, though, that was terrifying. It was the thought that I could have missed all of this, that I almost threw away the chance to be their father. Sarah touched his arm gently. But you didn't. You're here now. I want to be here always, he said, turning to face her. For them. For you, if you'll let me. The kiss, when it came, felt like coming home and starting fresh all at once. They took things slowly, carefully rebuilding what had been broken. Family game nights became a weekly tradition. The twins' bedtime routine expanded to include both parents. Alexander learned to cook badly at first, then better with practice, and Sunday morning pancake battles became legendary. Look what we made in art class, Emma bounded into Alexander's office one day, holding up a drawing. It showed 4 stick figures holding hands too tall, too small. My family was written across the top in wobbly letters. Alexander pinned it carefully next to his desk, right where every visitor would see it. In the end, he realized it wasn't about proving himself worthy. It was about being present, being consistent, being the father his children deserved, and the man Sarah had seen in him all along. But they were building something new, not the fairy tale romance of that first night, but something stronger. A family forged through forgiveness, strengthened by shared laughter, and bound together by love that had survived its hardest test. 1 year later, the backyard of the Chen Mitchell home glowed with string lights as family and friends gathered to celebrate the twins' 6th birthday. Jason and Emma raced between groups of guests, proudly showing off the treehouse their father had built, now complete with a working pulley system for their scientific experiments. Alexander stood by the grill, his once perfect suit replaced by casual clothes, watching Sarah arrange the twins' favorite chocolate cake. The diamond ring on her finger caught the evening light, a promise of their future together, given just last month. "Penny for your thoughts?" Sarah asked, coming to stand beside him. "Just thinking about how different everything was a year ago," he replied, pulling her close. "How empty my life was before you three came back into it." "Dad, Mum, it's time for cake," the twins called in unison, their amber eyes bright with excitement. As they gathered around the table, Alexander looked at his family, the family he'd nearly missed having, and felt complete for the first time in his life. Success meant nothing without love to share it with. The twins made their wish and blew out the candles together, just as they did everything else. But Alexander didn't need to wish for anything. His greatest dream had already come true.